go ahead and jump in and share my screen. And hopefully everyone will now see a slide called the home stretch, final year of the VA BBA 2. So I'm gonna just dive in here, and I'm excited to be talking with you guys today. Usually what I would be doing is leading some bird walks, often with Dr. Stephen Hopp, who gave a talk yesterday. So our two talks are actually gonna be a little interrelated. We'll kind of bounce off each other, and some of the things that he introduced to you yesterday, if you were in on his talk, I'm going to get into in a little bit more depth. So, but just to give you a sense of what we're going to go over today, the first section, really, I want to take a 10,000-foot view and talk to you guys about this project and put it in the context of the broader world of bird conservation and what's going on with bird populations in North America and the Western Hemisphere today, really around the world, but we'll not be that broad. And then I want to talk about atlasing in your own backyard, something that you all are now very familiar with, doing backyard naturalist activities. We're going to talk about how you can do that specifically for this project. And then we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive and talk about bird breeding behavior and what are some of the interesting, cool things that you end up learning and seeing as you participate in a project like the Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas. And then finally, we'll quickly, without taking too much time on it, go over so just some basics of how you would report data to our project through our project Ebird portal. So a little different system from iNaturalist, although iNaturalist is a great gateway for reporting your naturalist observations online, obviously. So let's get started with big picture, just give you a little bit of background about the BBA project. Out of curiosity, let's do our first poll. Let's start with a poll. How many of you have already contributed data or observations to the Breeding Bird Atlas? I think Lisa's got a poll question ready to go for that. So we'll take a second and get you all to answer. Oh, we've got two questions up there right
sorry,
now.
I didn't realize the second was going to come up.
That's okay. That's okay. Right now, we're mostly interested in the first one. How many of you have contributed data to this project already? So we'll take a second here to let you respond to that. I'm not sure how long we're usually giving folks, maybe 30 seconds or something. Everybody's got to wake up, get their coffee in their system, and remember how to use all these things.
I think we've gotten the majority of the responses. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and then share that.
Great. All right. So, this is excellent. So we've got a good number of newbies to the project, which is great. And we've also got a lot of folks living in Southwest Virginia, which is also great because we're going to spend much of our focus today on Southwest Virginia and why it's so important, and it's very much the focus of this project in its final year. Okay, so let's keep going. What is this project? Well, it's a citizen science-based effort to document the distribution and breeding status, as well as the abundance of all of the birds that breed across the Commonwealth of Virginia. So really what makes this project unique from a lot of other types of bird surveys is that we're not just interested in what species are out there and how many of each of those species there are, we're also interested in what they're doing. We want to know what their breeding status is, which means collecting breeding behavior. And breeding behavior is something we're going to talk about in much more depth here in a little while. But just to give you a quick illustration, breeding behavior can be everything from a wood thrush singing on its territory, shown on the left, to a gray catbird feeding her babies in the nest. So there's a huge range of behaviors that we want to document, and we'll talk about those, like I said, in more depth later. Just to give you some historical context for breeding bird atlases in the state of Virginia, this is the second one. The current one is the second one, and the first one was done in the 80s, so from 1984 to 1989. And at that time, they confirmed 196 species of birds breeding in Virginia. They had 205 total species in the state during that season, or during that time, and they had around 500 or so participants. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we're doing with this current project here in a bit. But first I want to talk about why now. Why are projects like the BBA so important and so timely in the broader context of what's happening with bird populations? The first key reason is that we really cannot take common for granted anymore when we're talking about birds. Many of you have seen probably these infographics or some of this information that came out of a big paper that was published last fall, which basically showed that we've lost 1 in 4 birds since the 1970s. 25% of our bird populations overall have disappeared, which is an astounding figure to consider when you think about the billions of birds on the landscape. That's a lot of organisms to lose, a lot of individuals to lose. And specifically, I wanted to give you a sense of what this means for particular types of birds. So migratory birds have been especially hard hit by this. There's been about a 28% population loss in migratory species, which equates to around 2.5 billion birds. And you know, when we think about migratory species, it's a lot of the stuff we're excited about coming back to Virginia right now. It's our Baltimore orioles shown here. It's all those beautiful warblers we have in our woods and mountains in the Southwest. It's the tanagers and the grosbeaks. It's all of those guys. So some of our most brightly colored, most beautiful birds are the ones that are getting hit the heaviest these days. But additionally, other species that are very close to home for those of us who live in the Appalachian part of Virginia are the eastern forest birds. So wood thrush, which is also a neotropical migrant, they've lost 6 out of 10 individuals since the 1970s, which is, again, an astounding figure to think about. And then the last one I wanted to touch on is grassland birds, because the Appalachian part of Virginia, you know, I don't know that grasslands often come to people's minds, but actually, you know, Southwest Virginia, the Mountain Valley region, the valleys are really important strongholds and really, what's the word I'm looking for? They're refuges for a lot of grassland nesting species that have been driven out of other more traditional areas. So we have a lot of grassland birds in the region, but they're also getting hit extremely hard. Eastern meadowlarks, I think, are one of the most dramatic examples of a species that it's experienced huge decline since the 1970s. They've lost 75% of their population. 3 out of 4 meadowlarks have disappeared from the landscape. And the thing that's tricky about meadowlarks is that there were so many of them to begin with that that decline kind of snuck up on us. You know, it's easy to look out across the landscape and say, oh, there's still a lot of meadowlarks out there. It's fine. It's not until we lose this number, this huge percent of the population, that we start taking note and realizing, holy cow, these birds are not doing well. So again, taking common for granted is not something we can really get away with anymore. A specific example I wanted to give you all, since it's, again, relevant to Southwest Virginia, is the Loggerhead Shrike, shown here. I think these are one of our most charismatic species of birds, especially for the smaller guys. They're also known as the butcher bird because if you know anything about this species, they're very well known for how predatory they are. They feed on everything from small mice to large insects, lizards, and they're known for grabbing their prey, excuse me, and spearing them on barbed wire or thorns, something like a locust tree, and using the thorns to tear up their prey and then consume it. So if you've got a shrike hanging out in your area, you'll often see barbed wire littered with little carcasses of their prey items. So it's a really charismatic, beautiful bird. But unfortunately, it's one that has also experienced pretty significant declines over the last 30 or 40 years. This is a map, and forgive me, it's a grainy map. We don't have great high-resolution maps available from the first breeding bird atlas, but this is the distribution and the breeding conformations of Loggerhead Shrike back in the 80s. The red dots just show you the general areas where there were confirmed breeding pairs throughout the state. Now you can see they weren't everywhere, but there was a pretty good distribution of them throughout the Mountain Valley region and even out in the southern Piedmont. If we look at what we've got now as far as reported and confirmed Loggerhead Shrike records, this is what we're looking at. This is what we've got so far. Yeah. It's a dramatic change from the 80s. And I think it's one of those that really illustrates for us how much is changing with these bird populations. And what's interesting is if you think about it from a habitat perspective, there hasn't been that dramatic of a change as far as land use and whatnot that's occurring throughout this middle Mountain Valley region where these birds have essentially disappeared. So there's other things going on. And that is something we could talk about for a whole other hour. I won't get into it in more depth right now, the possible reasons for this, but if you're interested, we can talk about this at the end, come back to this at the end. But I just wanted to illustrate an example of both a species that has declined dramatically, but also you'll note that the last really good refuge for Loggerhead Shrike in Virginia is in the Southwest. It's out in Russell, Washington, Smith, Tazewell, some of these counties out here is where, and really in the cattle ranching areas, is where we still have loggerhead shrike hanging on. So continuing with this theme of how important Southwest Virginia is for birds and for this project, here's just one more example of that. Okay, so why this particular project? Why is what we're doing for the Breeding Bird Atlas so important? First of all, and primarily, it's because we don't know the current distribution or status and distribution of most of the species of birds that breed in Virginia. We know that we've experienced a lot of loss. We know things have changed since the 80s, but in any given year, we're not monitoring most of these birds. We're only keeping track of a handful of them, like the shrike, golden-winged warbler, some cerulean warbler work. The species that we already knew were in big trouble are really the only ones that get much focus and much time and effort put into monitoring them, tracking their populations, and trying to get a handle on what's going on. And of course, that's related to resources. No one's surprised that state wildlife agencies have very limited resources, so it's a practical thing, but it makes our motivation for doing a project like the BBA all the more important. This is giving us an opportunity to get a much more updated snapshot of what's happening with a whole bunch of birds that are in trouble, but we don't really know how in trouble and how they're doing in Virginia. I switched over to this other picture just to give you an example of a few species who we know have declined in Virginia, but we didn't, before this project, we really didn't know too much about their current population status. So species like the common nighthawk, blue grosbeak, yellow-billed flycatcher, willow flycatcher. There's many more species, but these are just a few examples. And the other point to think about for why this project, and why we're trying to look at breeding birds across the entire state, is that things can change very quickly. So this figure on the left here is just an illustration of the pipelines, the new gas pipelines coming through Virginia that, if you live in the Southwest, you are inevitably familiar with this situation and the struggle for it. But, you know, things can change in a landscape that has been relatively untouched for a long time, like the national forest. These pipelines are coming through large tracts of national forests. They're opening corridors into contiguous forest patches that were not accessible before that. And that has a lot of serious implications and ramifications for our bird populations. So it's good to keep in mind that stuff can change very quickly, especially in terms of human land use and how it impacts wildlife. Okay, so that's all the dour stuff we're going to talk about today. We get the depressing things out of the way. I know they're kind of a bummer to be talking about first thing in the morning, but I think it's important to keep the broader context in mind of why we're doing this work and why it's so important. So let's talk about a little good news. So far in this project, I just wanted to give you some summary statistics of what we've accomplished so far over the first 4 years of the Breeding Bird Atlas, which, as I showed earlier, began in 2016. So far, we've documented over 516,000 breeding observations, breeding codes, which we'll talk about more. And those are data points that have been submitted to the Atlas eBird portal. So that's a pretty astounding volume of data. And what's even crazier is that actually equates to over close to 4.5 million birds reported to this project so far. 4.5 million. That's pretty phenomenal to think about. Then additionally, we've had over 1,200, closer to 1,300 different people, different contributors, add data to the project. And that's equated to over 60,000 field survey hours. So 60,000 hours that folks have volunteered their time for this project, which is phenomenal. And we're very proud and pleased with these numbers, but as we head into our final year, which is this year, as we head into last year of the project, we still have some gaps in our coverage and gaps in the areas we have data, and we're gonna talk about that here in a little more depth. First, I wanted to just also show you some cool things that are new and different in Virginia since the 1980s. There's a number of species breeding here that were not breeding here back then. 3 cool examples that I wanted to give you are the painted bunting, which is this glorious fellow on the left, who you can tell, man, that's a tropical bird who decided to come north to breed. That is not a bird that adapted to North American ecosystems right there, but they are beautiful birds. And additionally, the Mississippi kite, and then the anhinga. All three of these are species that are now confirmed breeders in Virginia, but that we did not have in the 80s. And I forgot to tell Lisa I was going to ask this question, but maybe just in the chat box, we can all answer this question. I'm curious to see, what do you guys, looking at these three new breeding species, I want to know what strikes you about these birds and what they may have in common. So if you want to think about that for a sec and then give us some responses in the chat box, I'd like to know what you think, again, these three species have in common that's relevant to this conversation. So we'll see if anybody has some thoughts. So we had some different things. Positively, okay, yep, so not native, not for this bunch, although it's a good point, Brenda, that we do have a lot of non-native breeders in Virginia and in the US these days. All right, we've got some responses rolling in. And it looks like most of our participants are very much on the same track and on the right track with this. So all of these, you guys are right on the money. This is all related to climatic change and the direction that southern breeders are moving, which is obviously north. So all of these species are species that traditionally bred in the deep south, you know, the southeast, from Florida up through maybe the Carolinas, the southern Carolinas, but all of these birds are making their way northward from their traditional southern breeding grounds and moving up the coast. So well done, you guys nailed that on the head. I'm impressed. All right, so continuing with some interesting species finds that have come out of the current Atlas project. This is one I thought it would be fun to bring up because it is directly a result of the Blue Ridge Discovery Center folks and also of Steve Hopp. The winter wren was a species that we've been chasing for the last 4 years. We knew that they were probably breeding in Virginia. We had them singing on territory every summer, but these guys like to put their nests in very inaccessible places in the high mountains. But then last summer, Steve and Kate Campbell were hiking up through Whitetop, up through that beautiful spruce fir forest up there. There's a picture of it, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And they got really lucky. And they came across these fellows. It was a little family group of winter wrens that had 2 or 3 fledglings bopping around through the spruce fir. So basically these guys were foraging in the understory and just hopping around Steve and Cade. So this was a fantastic breeding confirmation and one that we were excited to finally get for this project. Finally knock out winter wren as a confirmed breeder in Virginia. So this is just a fun example of something cool that's honestly a lot of firsts and a lot of really interesting records have come out of the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area and the surrounding landscape. There's a lot of really, as you know, unique and beautiful habitats in that area. And that doesn't just apply to the plants or the salamanders, it also applies to the birds, because there's not many places as high as Mount Rogers or Whitetop Mountain, which means that it's one of the few places that we have certain species breeding. Okay, so let's transition and start talking about backyard atlasing, because right now, most of us are a little constrained in terms of where we can get out and bird and collect information. And you guys this week, the last couple weeks, have already been very focused on collecting information in your backyards. And I was going through the iNaturalist records last night and saw some really interesting things popping up. So I thought we would spend a little time talking about, if you were interested in this project and contributing, especially information from your backyard or your local area, how could you do that? So in order to get to that, I want to kind of illustrate some big picture things for you about the project first, just to give you some context. We've got the state split into 12 big regions, and the one that the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area sits in kind of straddles the line between region 7 and 8. But when you hear us talking about the southwestern regions, really what we're talking about is this pink and blue area here. This whole swath is what we typically refer to as Southwest Virginia. And what I wanted to show you is some subsequent maps I'm going to show you guys of our coverage have all these blocks. And I just wanted you to know, when we start talking about atlas blocks, what are we talking about? How have we split the state up into measurable, survey units? Well, this is what we've done. Basically, we took all the USGS topo quad maps and we split them into 6 equal blocks, shown here. And each of those blocks, is about 9 square miles. And we don't need to get into too much of this detail, but for each of the US quad maps, we made the southeasternmost block the priority block. So this one down here in the bottom corner of each quad is the one we're trying most to get. But we're still interested in getting data in all the blocks, especially if somebody lives in a block and is getting interesting breeding data. So one of the reason I keep bringing up the Southwest and emphasizing it is not just that that's where many of us are located, but it's because it's one of the last areas in the state that we really need more breeding bird data. And the reason being that, you know, we don't have as many volunteers out in the Southwest. If you live out there, you know that there's not that many people. Our population densities are much lower in this region, which also means we've just got fewer birders, fewer potential volunteers. So that's one of the reasons I'm talking to you all today. This is a map of our current data coverage for the state of Virginia through this project. Kind of looks like Easter egg colors. The purples and the blues and the greens are where we have the most data. The thing I really want you to take note of is the areas in white, yellow, and orange. That's where we have the least data. And I was saying Southwest Virginia is our focus. Well, you can see that we've got quite a lot of Southwest Virginia that has some pretty big data gaps. Yes, we have some other gaps over in the kind of western, southern Piedmont, but we're not going to focus on that today. We're going to stay focused on Southwest Virginia. And I show you this just to illustrate again, this is where we need help. We need your help. The backyard birds of Southwest Virginia are, ironically, many of our priority species. Those of you who live out in these areas know you get some pretty cool stuff. Now, if you're not high up in the mountains, you may not be getting things like yellow-bellied sapsuckers or veeries, but you might be getting things like grasshopper sparrows down in the valleys. You might have some black burnians around in your woods or some rose-breasted grosbeak. Maybe if you're high up, even a Canada warbler. The point being that a lot of the species that you all may take for granted as birds you have around your property or down the street from you, you know, in the woods near you, are priority species for us that we really want to get more and better records for. So this is just a different map kind of illustrating the same thing as the Easter egg map. These are the blocks that are colored and highlighted are all the ones that we're prioritizing for this year. This is where we want to try to get this field season. And as you can see, there's a huge concentration of those in Southwest Virginia. So plenty of opportunity to contribute some observations out here. So where do we start? If you're interested in this, if you're interested in contributing observations like some of the ones you already have to iNaturalist, how do you go about that? I thought I'd just walk through some very simple steps, things to think about if you want to participate in this project. First of all, basic survey guideline is just figuring out what block, what atlas area your house, your property is in. That's a good first step. And the way you can do that is very straightforward. We've got a Block Explorer, a Map Explorer tool on our Atlas website at vabba2.org. So you can go on there, you can plug in the town you're near, you can even plug in your house address, and it'll zoom in and it'll show you right where you're at and what Atlas block you're in. And if you do that, what you'll see when you pull up that map is you get a topo map of the block. So let's say this is the one for White Top Mountain. I just picked that one as an illustration. So if you lived on White Top Mountain, this is where that map would zoom you into. And I just wanted to illustrate, you can download these for any block in the state and you can mark where your house is. And so it can kind of give you a sense of, okay, in the context of, in the context of this project, you know, where does my house sit? What's the block that I'm adding data to? And the second step, the second thing you want to think about is what habitat types are present in my block or on my property. This is really one of the most important questions because this is just a Google Earth image of an Atlas block. Even with Google Earth, we can look at this and say, okay, we've got a river running through, so we've got river edge habitat. It's going to have different species than, say, some of this interior woodland habitat we see over here. It's going to have different species than out in these fields, some of these agricultural fields. So the reason we emphasize habitat is that when you're thinking about collecting breeding bird data, you want to make a point of trying to go to all the different habitats you might have access to in your property or in your neighborhood and try to log the different species of birds present there. So then the third thing to think about, to start doing, is just start walking around, right? Do what you would normally birding. Start walking around and start building your species list. So just documenting who's here, you know, what species am I seeing, getting a rough idea of how many you're seeing. And then we get to the most fun step, in my opinion, documenting breeding methods. So this is the part that's new for the most people. Even if you're an experienced birder, you may have never taken the time, because why would you, to really document what the birds are doing. But that's the thing that we want to do that's so different and unique from this project, is actually making behavioral observations and taking note of that sort of thing. So let's dive into breeding behaviors. Like I said, this is some of my favorite part of this project because I think this stuff is fascinating, and hopefully you will too before we get done. So just to illustrate how we've kind of got the breeding behavior classification set up, obviously there's a lot of different things that you could see when you're out on the landscape. Birds are doing all sorts of stuff this time of year when there's a ton of species coming through. That can be overwhelming. So to make it a little simpler on you, what we've done is created a set of breeding categories and codes that almost everything you see birds doing should be able to fit into somewhere. So in terms of the breeding categories, we've got them set up. There's 4 categories that go from observed to possible, probable, and confirmed. So confirmed being the pinnacle. This is, well, I'll give you examples in a minute, but this is what we're shooting for, is to try to confirm as many species as we can. And then within these 4 categories, there's a total of 24 specific breeding codes. So what I'm going to do is go through and illustrate some of these breeding codes for you. And I've pulled in some examples that when I went through and looked at your iNaturalist observations for birds, I found some folks had actually already documented some pretty cool breeding codes, breeding behaviors. So I pulled a few of those out just to show you guys. All right. So in the first breeding category, there's really only one actual code. The observed category really just has flyover. And this is just a standard code. You know, if you get a bald eagle soar through your block, he doesn't land, he doesn't do anything else but fly over your head. There you go. You got a flyover bald eagle. And that's all there is to it. Jumping into the next category, which has a few more codes, the possible. This is the one you're going to use most commonly because this is the stuff you're seeing most commonly. You've got your singing males or your singing females. S is probably one of the most common codes we see. But calling it singing male is honestly kind of a misnomer because we're learning more and more that a lot of female birds sing. So don't be alarmed if you're out there and you see something like a female tanager singing. They do it. We don't know how often. It's still something that's very poorly studied, but a lot of folks are working on it and trying to get a better handle on it. So if you were to see that, know that it's okay. You can still call that an S code because female birds are singing for the same reasons the males are in many cases. So I pulled this example out of iNaturalist because one, Reinhard took a beautiful picture of a blue-headed vireo that I wanted to show. But then additionally, Judith McCord got a really cool recording that I'm going to play here now. So hopefully you guys will be able to hear this. Now it's a little quiet, unfortunately. That's the loudest I can make it, but hopefully you could hear the very loud, sort of talkative song of the blue-headed vireo. He wasn't singing a lot, but there were a couple bouts in there of his song. But the other thing that's cool about this recording, and is a plug for recording songs when you hear them, is that Judith also had ovenbirds, and I'm pretty sure black burnie and warblers singing on that same recording at that same location. So not only did she have blue-headed vireos, but she had a couple of other very cool migratory species captured on that.
Could you play it one more time?
Sure, yep. And the first part is quiet, so there's not much happening in the first part, and then the songs start coming in. So that was the blue-headed vireo, that loud. Oops, now we're looping. Ah! So the ovenbird, for those of you who are interested, the ovenbird was that very strong background song that you could hear. And then the Blackburnian was the very, very high song that only happened a couple times. For many people, the Blackburnian song is out of their range of hearing. But on that recording, you know, nice thing about recordings, you can amplify them, really shoot the volume up and often make out a lot more. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead here to another possible code, which is very commonly used, H in suitable habitat. So this is basically, you've got a bird, it's sitting there, you think it probably should be breeding here, but it's not singing, it's not doing anything else, it's just sitting there, driving you crazy. So if you see that, you can still tag it as a possible breeder by using the H code, the in suitable habitat. All right, now we're going to get into some of the more interesting codes in the probable category. So this is sort of category level 3, pair in suitable habitat. So this is a very common code, and it's one that you would think would be pretty straightforward, but it can be tricky. So for a species like this is a lovely example of a pair of birds that you could use this code on. And the reason being that wood ducks are extremely dimorphic, meaning they look very different, the male and the female. There's no mistaking a male wood duck for a female wood duck. So great example of species you could use this code for. There's another species, there's many species in fact, that this code is tricky and you really can't use it for because they're monomorphic. They look the same. And just looking at them up in the trees, on the ground, wherever, you can't tell the difference. So I thought I'd be tricky. We're going to do a quiz here. I'm going to play some calls, and we're going to talk about this species in a little more depth. But first I'm going to play it, and I want to see if you guys can tell me what these birds are. So listen close. This is probably going to be loud because this is not a quiet recording. So hopefully you won't have to strain to hear this. Okay. So I see the chat box lighting up a little bit. Looks like maybe some folks have some ideas on what those birds were. Yep, we nailed it. 3 of our folks, Trish, Whitney, and Serena all nailed it. Barred owl. Exactly, exactly. So barred owls are an interesting example of a species that if you just saw these birds, which I'm showing now, if you just saw this pair of birds sitting up in the trees, calling it a pair in suitable habitat would be a challenge, right? Because aside from some very slight size dimorphism, they look the same. So as a rule, species that have the exact same plumage and no real, strong characteristics, we say don't use the pair in suitable habitat code. But just to make it, tricky for you, barred owls, that call I was just playing for you guys, which is known as, some folks call it caterwauling. Whenever you hear that, it's always a male and female pair talking to each other. So males don't do that at each other. This is a pair bonding vocalization that they use either when they're courting or just when they're kind of doing this pair bond affirmation thing. They get up in the trees and the male will start with his little who cooks for you, and then the female, and then all of a sudden it sort of erupts into this crazy monkey chatter that we call caterwauling. So if you hear that you can actually call pair in suitable habitat, because you know that you've got a male and a female up there hollering at each other, and odds are that they're in their territory if it's during the breeding season, which would be right now. So that's just a little tidbit for you. If you've ever been startled out in the woods at night because you heard that crazy caterwauling coming out of the forest, know that that was a male and a female talking to each other. Okay, now we're going to talk about another interesting probable code, and I'm actually going to jump to a different screen here, and I'm going to show you a video. So hopefully in a second, you all should be seeing a black screen. Lisa, are you seeing that black screen now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to play this video, and I want you all to take note of what this pair of birds is doing. Forgive me if the video quality is a little great. guys will do this for a long time before somebody finally eats that berry. So cedar waxwings are another cool example of a species of bird that are, again, monomorphic. You can't tell who's the male and who's the female there, but that behavior you just saw is very significant. Let me jump back to my PowerPoint here. And the reason it's significant is that this is a classic example of a courtship behavior, courtship display or courtship behavior, which is another probable breeding code. So oftentimes, especially this time of year, when we've got a lot of birds coming in, they're setting up territories, they're starting to breed, especially in terms of the migrants, if you start paying attention to what birds are doing, you'll see these interesting little behaviors happening. And a lot of times we look at them, and if we're not tuned to thinking breeding behavior, we just think, oh, that's weird, or interesting, but then you move on. But really, there's a ton of courtship behavior happening on the landscape right now. And I will admit that even though I have a long background in birds, I really wasn't as focused on breeding birds before I started this project, and I had learned a tremendous amount about all of the different types of courtship behaviors that you can see in different species of birds, and it's just fascinating. And this one you saw with the cedar waxwings exchanging the food back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. They will do that over and over and over again as part of their courtship ritual. And then maybe eventually, if the male gets lucky, he actually gets to copulate with the female. Sometimes she just says, thank you for the food, peace out, and takes off, which maybe isn't as friendly. But okay, let's talk about a different probable code now. Nest building. So there's a specific nest building code that we use for cavity nesters. So this is everything from woodpeckers to chickadees to nuthatches, titmice, any of the cavity nesters, because these guys will excavate cavities not only for a nest, but also for roosting cavities. So one of the challenges we have is just because you see a bird cleaning out a cavity doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a nest site. So that's why this nest building code falls into the probable category. But on the flip side, there's a confirmed nest building code that we use for most species that build traditional nests, what we would think of as a traditional nest, you know, the cup nest or some sort of actual nest structure that isn't just tucked into a hole somewhere. And I had to pull this example in from iNaturalist because, let me tell you, I almost fell out of my chair when I saw that Alan Boynton had caught a female ruby-throated hummingbird building a nest on his porch, on like a little glass thingy he's got hanging on his porch. This is remarkable for a lot of reasons, but primarily because hummingbirds usually hide their nests very well in vegetation. You know, they hide them in trees. They kind of glue these tiny little cup nests made out of moss and lichens and downy feathers and all that. They glue it onto a tree branch somewhere very hidden. So I was just shocked to see this female building a nest in an area that looks pretty open and pretty exposed, but it's fascinating. And as you can see, Alan was able to capture this beautiful photograph of her sitting on this tiny little nest, and it's such a good illustration of how small their nests actually are. And what's really crazy is if you can get pictures of the eggs, and you see they're about the size of Tic Tacs. They're just tiny, tiny little eggs. So anyway, this is a really cool confirmed breeding code, and it's one that many of you probably are familiar with and have probably come across quite a bit on your own properties as actual nest sites. So this is another good illustration of the types of good data that you can log in your own backyard. This is I call this what happens when you never put your purple martin box up and you leave it to the wrens. So watch the martin box for a second, see what happens here. Oh, hello. Oh, number 2. So I was sitting watching hummingbirds one day, and some vegetation, some flowers that are right in front of this admitted pile of junk that we had behind a shed. And sure enough, we had this pair of Carolina wrens building a nest in the top of this old martin box. So don't throw away your nest boxes, even if you're not using them in the traditional way, because other things may use them. But I thought this was a neat way to see how birds will utilize and build, many species of birds will utilize and build nests in unexpected places. So, and also that was a good nest building code, but oftentimes you will catch wrens carrying nest material. You catch lots of species carrying nest material, and that's another great way to confirm a bird is breeding, is if you see it carrying sticks, moss, lichens, feathers, horsehair, man, you name it, all kinds of materials that birds will use to build and line their nests with. So that's another good way to confirm that a bird is probably nesting nearby. And this picture is, again, something that Alan Boynton logged on iNaturalist, which is a house wren coming into a nest box, looks like, with some nesting material. And I'm going to put in a plug for the house wren, because a lot of people, a lot of us who like bluebirds and tree swallows, you know, we get cranky because house wrens like to take over our bluebird boxes and our tree swallow boxes. But just keep in mind, these guys are native. So unlike the evil house sparrow or the starling that take over nest cavities or nest spaces and are invasive and terrible, house wrens, while they might frustrate us because we want something else there, they are native species, so cut them some slack. Okay, another example of confirmed code would be fledged young. Now, it might seem a little early for fledged young, but actually there's quite a few species that start breeding earlier in Virginia and could have fledged young in the landscape. This is just one example. Great horned owls, they start breeding very early, so they honestly could have pretty big, rapidly maturing juveniles on the landscape now. But this is one of the best ways to confirm great horned owls, even though it's still really hard to find, is happening to come upon fledged young sitting up in the woods, because these guys will be sitting out in the open during the daytime, just kind of hanging out, waiting for mom and dad to bring them some food. And a lot of times you'll hear these really terrible, garbled, kind of cackling calls that you think, what the heck is that screech, you know? And it's a young great horned owl hollering at mom or dad to bring them some more food. So fledged young, something you see pretty frequently, especially as we get further into May and into June. Suddenly the landscape's going to sort of explode with young birds who are still dependent on mom and dad, but are out of the nest and hopping around doing stuff. So that's a good way to confirm breeding as well. Another common confirmed code is carrying food. And the one thing to remember about this is you want to make sure you don't just see a bird fly by with food and that's it, because that's a little like, well, what's he doing? That doesn't necessarily mean he's bringing food to a mate or to chicks, but if you see a bird repeatedly flying in the same direction with food, maybe flying into a bush, flying up into a tree, carrying food, that's when this code comes into handy, because more than likely it means that there's, as I said, either a mate or a nest site with young or something of that nature nearby, and that's who he or she's delivering food to. Okay, so this was kind of my overview of breeding codes. This isn't all of the breeding codes. I wasn't going to make you guys listen to me talk about all of those today. If you want to see the complete list, we have so many resources on our Atlas webpage, including the handbook. The Atlas handbook has all of the breeding codes and details related to the breeding codes, and probably more information than you could want, but you could use. So that's a good resource. So just to leave this section, to wrap up this section, I wanted to talk about a few more tips for observing breeding behaviors. So one of the things that's challenging for folks who have already been birders, or maybe are people who like to hike and they like to really move when they're outside, is that to collect breeding data, you really need to slow down. Some of our older volunteers, this is actually one of the things that they like about the Breeding Bird Atlas, is that honestly, sometimes some of your best observations are when you take a camp chair and you plunk it down on the edge of the woods where you've had a lot of activity, and you just sit there and you wait and you watch for that red start to start moving, carrying food somewhere, carrying nest material, or you start watching that wood thrush out in the woods doing something. There's lots of examples, but the point being that if you slow down and really stop and take the time to watch what the birds are doing, that's when you're going to start seeing more of these behaviors and actually being able to document those. Another thing to think about is to consider the timing. So when are you? What time of year is it? And the reason this is important is that, you know, right now we've got a lot of birds who are just showing up on the landscape. They're just arriving on migration. It's early to start tagging those guys with breeding codes because they really haven't had time to get started, and we've still got a lot of other individuals passing through. So keeping timing in mind is important. Another resource that we have on the Atlas website are these breeding timeline charts that you can look up and download and basically tell you like who should be breeding right now, who's still migrating, who's starting to breed, who's fully in their breeding window. So that's another good resource as you start digging into this Atlas stuff more. And then again, what we've been talking about for a while now related to behavior is just paying more attention to what the birds are doing. So not just who they are, not just what species, but also what the species is doing. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about where to report observations. Because as I said earlier, our project uses, we don't use iNaturalist because while it's awesome, there are some features and some limitations of iNaturalist that make it, you know, not ideal for a project like this. So instead we use Ebird, which is sort of the big daddy web tool for collecting bird data, bird information. So I just quickly wanted to point out that, you know, if you're interested in this stuff and you want to start reporting some of your observations, especially your backyard stuff to us, there's two ways you can do it. You can download the Ebird app, like you would the iNaturalist app, and you can do it all on your phone. You don't ever have to get on a computer if you don't want to. Or if you're someone who's like, I hate smartphones, I want to do it on the computer, it's just easier for me, then you can go and do it on the computer. And you just have to go to the Atlas Ebird portal. So what I'm going to do now is again bounce out of here to a different screen, if I can get my computer to play nice. And I'm going to show you guys what the Atlas Ebird portal looks like. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to give you an illustration of what this looks like, and in a very quick, basic way, how you could report an observation to our project. So now I want to ask a question that you can answer in the chat box if you want. I saw some great breeding observations in the iNaturalist portal. You know, I got some singing birds from Judy McCord. We got Alan's nest building from the ruby-throated hummingbird and the house wren. But I'd like to see if you guys had if you've been seeing other breeding behaviors in your area. I thought we could see what examples we could come up with in the chat, and then we'll pick one or two of those and actually walk through how you would report that in Ebird. So I'll give you guys a second to share if there's any breeding stuff, breeding behaviors, breeding evidence that you've been seeing lately around your house or in your area that we could use as a demo for entering into the Atlas Ebird portal. And don't be shy, because I'm sure you've been seeing stuff. I saw some of it on iNaturalist. Whoa, there we go. Steve Hopp had a good one. Oh, now we're cooking. All right, so Steve had wood thrush nest with eggs. Dennis Ross had wood duck hatching. Oh man, Dennis had 12 wood ducks hatching yesterday. That's awesome. We also have a lot of singing males, multiple. Oh boy, we've got plenty to pick from. This is excellent. So I'm going to use Dennis's example for now, just because he actually mentioned 2 different birds. So I can show you doing a checklist that has more than just one observation on it. So for now, we'll go with Dennis's, but maybe we'll come back and use an additional. I love all the examples that are coming in. See, you guys, you're making me excited. This is why I want you to participate in this project and report data to us, because obviously you're seeing some fantastic stuff out there on the landscape. And since most of you are in Southwest Virginia, whew, I want those data, guys. I want it. All right. So let me show you how we start. Like I said, we're going to use Dennis as an example to start with. Dennis and I got to know each other on an adventure up to Mount LeConte in the Smokies this spring, which was a lot of fun. And I talked his ear off about breeding birds and badgered the poor guy into adding data, helping add data to our project. All right, so first step, if you wanted to come in and report some of this breeding behavior you're seeing, you would navigate to the Atlas Ebird portal, which we will also give you. Lisa stuck the Atlas website address up. We'll also put the website up for the Atlas Ebird portal. Big thing to keep in mind, there's different portals in Ebird. Just like in iNaturalist, you have different projects. Well, there's different portals in Ebird, and you want to make sure you're in the right one, which is the Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas. So you always want to look and make sure there's this logo up in the left-hand corner that says Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas. So once you're there, you go to submit, and hopefully Ebird will be nice and not go too slow for us. Okay, so the first thing they're gonna ask you is, where was it? So you have some options. As you start using Ebird more, it's gonna save your location. So the easiest thing to do is just to go to a map, and you can either enter your county name or navigate to somewhere. I'm gonna stick with White Top. So we're gonna navigate to White Top. And as you can see, if a name matches an Atlas block name, it's gonna take you right there. So let's just say we were in White Top, Southeast. Let's say that that's where Dennis had his wood ducks, which maybe not very likely. Don't know how many ponds are out there, but we're just using this as an example. So you can enter a location, it'll take you to this big picture view, and you could zoom in, and you can either zoom in and find wherever you're at, or you can actually enter your address or enter some coordinates. You've got a lot of options for how you plot location. I'm just gonna drop a pin and pretend this is Dennis's house. Don't worry, Dennis, I will erase this. So fear not that a weird thing's going in. All right, so once we've got our location, we've dropped our pin, this is where the birds were, or this is where I started my count. We're gonna go to the next step, which is date and effort. So what day was it? What day is it? May 10th. We're gonna pretend it was today. And we're gonna see that we have several options in terms of what types of observation, really what type of checklist we're entering. So today, for just illustrating backyard stuff, we're gonna focus on incidental checklists, because these require the least information. It's just gonna ask you, what time was it that you saw this? We're gonna pretend it was 8 o'clock. How many people? We'll just say it was 1. And then if you wanna put any comments in here, you can. Now, the one thing I should tell you all about incidental checklists is that they don't document any effort for the project. So let's say you actually spent an hour watching your pond. Well, if you were in the same spot watching your pond, you could enter that as a stationary count. And the additional thing it's going to ask you is, how long were you there? So you can say, I was there for an hour. And then the third option you have is a traveling count. So this is if you're out walking around. Let's say you do a half-mile loop around your property, okay? Takes you an hour because you're going slow, you're birding. Then all you would say is, okay, it took me I walked a half mile, it took me an hour, same details, all right? Then the nice thing about the traveling and the stationary counts is that, again, it captures some effort for us. So we can say, oh, look at that. Dennis actually logged an hour of birding time in this block, and that's great because that gives us much more information to work with than if we only do incidental checklists. But I'm going to back up again and just use incidental as our demo here. So once we've got our date and our checklist information entered, we're going to jump to the next step, which is, what birds did we see? Okay, so in Dennis's case, we had wood ducks and we had Canada goose. Let me find his observation. Okay, wood duck hatching 12. So I'm going to say that, let's say there was the female there plus 12 hatchlings, so that's 13 birds. All right, to enter breeding codes, anytime you go to a species, if you enter a number, it's going to ask, do you want to enter any breeding codes or any other details? You click there and you choose the breeding code from this drop-down menu. So we're going to say recently fledged young. And you don't have to do this, but we'll put in a little note that says 12 hatchlings from wood duck box, just to illustrate this, all right? And then you also have the option here, if you want to, of throwing in a picture, if you have a photograph, or if you have a recording, like Judy's song recording, you can throw that in with an observation as well. And I'm also going to add Dennis's Canada goose gosling. So I'm just going to make a assumption here and say he had a pair of adults with a gosling. So we'll say there were 3 geese. Again, we'll add another recently fledged young code, and boom, we're good. All right, so at this point, once you've got your species data in there, you would look over here. Now, if you were doing a stationary count or a traveling count, instead of saying, no, I'm not submitting a complete checklist or all the birds I saw, you would say, yes, I am submitting a complete checklist, because presumably if you were sitting there for an hour, you were writing down all the different birds that you were seeing. So you would put all those on this list. and then it would be reported as a complete checklist. But in this case, we're just doing an incidental for these couple records. So we would say, nope, it wasn't a complete list, and we'd submit. I'm not going to submit since this is a fake checklist for now. But hopefully this gives you, I know this was kind of a quick boom, boom, boom walkthrough of how you would enter a checklist through the computer. But you know, if you're interested in this, if you'd like to be able to contribute data, if you go up, if you're on the Atlas portal, the same place, you look up at the top, there's all these tabs for places you can go. If you go to news, I'm going to leave this page. If you go to news, it brings you to this page with all these articles related to this project. And there's Atlas tutorials, there's essential Atlas tutorials, and a bunch of these are actually articles about things like data entry, how to go about reporting observations to Ebird. You'll see we have a whole series on Atlas data entry in Ebird. So the first one is exactly what I just showed you, recording incidental observations. Then we jump to submitting complete checklists, all these things. So there's a ton of good resources in here. And additionally, you know, myself and Steve Hopp, who is the regional coordinator for the southwestern region of Virginia for this project, for the Atlas, we're always happy to help folks answer questions, help you troubleshoot, that sort of thing. So you can always reach out to us too if you're struggling to figure out Ebird. In fact, you know, these days with us being stuck in our offices and at home so much more, I've been doing a lot more webinars and tutorials on how to, you know, do various Atlas things. And I would be happy to do another, an Ebird webinar to walk people through how to do data entry in more depth if there was interest in that. So, you know, you can always reach out to us and let us know if you're looking for more information from us. Okay.
Actually, I have a question from Chris Sokol. It says,
yeah.
if you've entered breeding info in regular Ebird, should you move it to the Atlas portal?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Chris. Thank you. Yes, yes, you should. And the reason being that if you don't, then there's a good chance we're not going to get it. So unfortunately, the way Ebird is set up, the breeding codes that go into the regular Ebird portal, the way that they are entered and the way that the data is stored, it's a lot harder for us to use that information because we can't have as much confidence that people were actually paying attention to, say, the Atlas blocks, like where they were, because regular Ebird doesn't tell you, it doesn't give you any information about where you were relative to the Atlas stuff. So it gets tricky for us trying to move data over. And actually, I'm glad you asked that, Chris, because since we're in Ebird, I can really quickly show you how you would do that. If you've got an Atlas checklist in regular Ebird that already or has breeding codes but is in the wrong place, I'll show you really quick how you would move it because it's easy. So whenever you pull up a checklist, there's this button, checklist tools. If this is something you've already entered now, you can click checklist tools and you scroll down and there's a change portal button. And all you do is pick from the drop down menu and you would pick Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas and you would plug it into there. And that's all you have to do. Just click change portal, boom, you're done. So it's pretty straightforward how to do that. If you've got a bunch of checklists, it can take some time, but it's worth doing because then we get that data.
Does it change, does it keep it in both places or does it move it from one to the other?
So it moves it into the Atlas portal, but it's still in regular Ebird. So
okay.
Basically, you know, it's weird because if it's in regular Ebird, we don't have it, but if it's in the Atlas, regular Ebird still has it or also
right.
has it. So yeah, so it's still all contributing to your stats and all that stuff. Yeah, great question. Let me jump, unless there are other questions about Ebird for now, because I'm about to wrap up. I know I'm about to go over my hour.
Allison has a comment in chat.
Oh yeah, Allison, let's see. Oh my gosh, I've used Ebird for years. Yay, Allison. I never knew about all this extra data that can be used. So cool. I will now pay more attention when there is a chance that I've witnessed breeding behavior. Yes, thank you, Allison. That's excellent. We would love for you to be logging data. And hopefully, if you're already familiar with Ebird, hopefully figuring out putting it into the Atlas portal shouldn't be too challenging. But yeah, you know, a lot of people are out birding all the time and just haven't realized that there's this extra layer of data that gives us so much more information so much richer information about what's going on with these birds on the landscape. So we really appreciate folks who are willing to take that extra step, log those breeding codes into our portal, and you know, give us some really great information. Like I said, if you're in the Southwest, man, we can use it. We'd love to get more data out there. Especially, you know, some of you guys, just to revisit some of the species y'all mentioned, there's a lot of mention of thrushes and different singing migratory species, and so many of those are priorities for us since they are declining rapidly. We really want to know who's still here and where are they in Southwestern Virginia, where are they still breeding. So lots of good stuff you guys can contribute for us. All right, I'm gonna jump, oh, let's see. Kevin says, can you put info directly into the atlas or just through Ebird? So there isn't a directly into the atlas except through Ebird. So that is, the Atlas Ebird portal is the atlas in terms of data collection. Now, if you go to the regular Atlas website that we've shown you, vabba2.org, you can get to the Atlas Ebird portal. There's links there. You know, if you go to this submit data page, there are links that will take you to the Atlas Ebird portal. So that's another way to navigate to the right place. But yeah, to answer that question, into Ebird is into the Atlas. Now, the one caveat to that is, you know, if for some reason, if there's a real problem, sometimes we have hunters report information to us, and you know, most of these hunters, they're not gonna take the time to learn Ebird, which is understandable because they're not really spending most of their time ebirding. But in that case, we've had hunters feed us information, like to Steve or to me even, about say turkeys, grouse, you know, breeding woodcock, breeding evidence they come across when they're out in the woods. And we can, for people like that, sometimes we can plug in those incidental observations, but that's sort of a special circumstance. Oh, Trish asked a very good question. Where can we see the species that are priority? So again, Trish, on the Atlas website, vabba2.org, under our resources, we've got a handbook and materials page. The handbook has all the priority species listed, and there's also a separate link that just shows you the priority species list is on there. So actually, while we're talking about that, I'm just going to navigate to that page really quick. Yep, if I can make this come up. And I'll just show you guys some of these materials I'm talking about. So this is the main Atlas website. I know it's confusing that we have an Ebird portal and an Atlas webpage, but unfortunately the Ebird portal can't do everything we need a website to do. So we have this, you know, kind of main regular website that we use for the project where we dump a lot of our materials and our resources and things. So if you scroll down to Trisha's question, handbook and materials, if you click there, there's this page that has all kinds of goodies. The Atlas handbook, which you can download as a PDF, those breeding timeline charts, the priority species list, which Trish asked about. There's all kinds of resources on there that you can download. So this is kind of the depot for a lot of the resources and information for the project. And even the tutorials that I was showing you on Ebird, on our Ebird portal, those are actually also available here under our news and resources page. There's all kinds of webinars that we've done and recorded, as well as the written tutorials and information are down here. So lots of information to be had for those folks who want to take the next step and kind of follow up on this for themselves. Kevin, can you transfer info? No, we can't use, he was asking, can you transfer info from Merlin or Musket Ebird? Yeah, so Merlin really isn't set up to collect the kind of, to collect data in the way that we need it to be the way that we need it to be collected. So regular Ebird is a challenge. Merlin is even more of a roadblock for us getting data. So good questions, good things to clarify. All right, I'm gonna switch my screen back over to, where to go? The PowerPoint real quick and just wrap up here since we're approaching the end. And we can still take time at the very end, obviously, for some more questions, if there's more questions from you guys. So let me, we've basically talked through this, so I'm not gonna stay on this. Atlas, I just showed you the Atlas webpage. So I just, for the sake of wrapping up formally, wanted to say that we're in the final stretch of this project. As I said earlier, we're in the final year. which makes it even more important that we get more information, more data in Southwest Virginia. So we hope that you'll consider reporting data to us. We'd love to get more information from y'all. And with that, I'm going to formally wrap up and just say a special thanks to all the volunteers who contributed. A lot of the Blue Ridge Discovery Center folks, including Lisa and Aaron, have contributed really great data to us. And Cade Campbell's another one. Cade Campbell is actually going to be working for me this summer as an Atlas field technician for our small crew of paid folks that we have out on the landscape in the summer. So everybody root for Cade. He's last year contributed some fantastic data as a volunteer. So we kind of went after and recruited him this year to work for us because he's such a great young naturalist. And I'm excited about the information he's going to collect out on the landscape this summer. So like I said, reach out to me and Steve. And then lastly, I just want to give a shout out for Lisa for being the person juggling all of this stuff over the weekend. I can tell you, managing a lot of Zoom meetings myself, a lot goes into this. So well done, Lisa, and thank you for facilitating all of this. It's great.
It's been my pleasure. And actually, although I'm kind of here by myself today, I actually, for the first time in like 5 years, I'm actually getting to be a part of the actual rally. I'm getting to actually go on the guided trips. So this is kind of nice. And I've gotten to see and be like front row of all of it. So it's been great for me too. And I really appreciate all of you guys stepping up and doing this for us and with us. It's been really, really fun and enjoyable. And I've gotten to learn a tremendous amount. And I will do a better job myself with getting the Ebirds and everything in the right place. So this has been helpful for us as well. Anybody have any last questions for Ashley? I don't see any popping up. I see lots of thank yous though. And we thank you as well. So I hope everybody can get out there and contribute to Ebird and the Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas for this last year. And we will see you with Ben Castile at 11.
All right, thanks everyone for participating and hanging in there. I know it was a lot of information. It was a long talk, but hopefully you learned a lot, and I look forward to seeing some data from you.
Great. Have a good day.
All right, take care, guys.
Thank you.